Okay. Right, so we're now recording. I'll monitor the lobby and I'll start admitting. Here we go. Morning, Billy. Morning, Podreg. Morning, Phil. Morning, Con. Morning, Peter.
Morning, Steve.
Morning, Peter. Peter B. Peter CB. Hang on, let's just bring Chris in. Morning, Chris. Thanks for joining. Let's just do that. If you've just joined, if you could mute, please, that would be great. Billy, if you could mute, that would be good as well. Just to cut down any background noise. Perfect, thank you. Okay, perfect. And
the 2nd of February because we have a right to terminate.
Good morning, Henry. Henry's come in very noisily. Morning, Henry. You got the radio on or the TV on? I think there we go. He's muted himself. He looks very smart. Morning, Henry. Thank you for joining. Good to see you. Okay, I'll monitor the lobby, Bobby, as usual. First of all, welcome everybody to this week's Pension Playpen Coffee Morning. Delighted that Bobby Ridaway is going to be presenting his thoughts on the PMI Conference. This is a little bit of a sort of a fluid conversation, in conversation with. So as usual with Pension Playpen, if you'd like to ask any questions or make a point, then please raise a hand and I'll be delighted to bring you into the conversation. And today we're being recorded, so Chris, Derek, Billy, Con, everybody's happy. Henry, being recorded, fine, okay. So we'll put the recording up later on this afternoon onto the Pension Playpen website. But as I say, if you want to ask any questions, please raise a hand and any comments can go in the chat. But as you know, I or Henry will bring you in to the conversation. So Bobby, over to you. Thanks in advance for your time this morning. I think we're all looking forward to hearing from the chair of the PMI conference post-match analysis. So over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is just go through the sessions that I was in, just give you a summary of what was in the session and what I thought about the session. I'm happy to take questions session by session or at the end. I think as the sessions vary, then maybe at the end. But as Henry pointed out before the conference, a lot of the sessions are about endgame. And if you know me, I'm really hoping that we can get away from thinking that DBs is the end of pensions and we can get talking about future pensions that actually work. And there's actually quite a lot of schemes reopening at the moment. I don't think we'll have 5,000 schemes reopened, but I think we're certainly getting to a point where we're getting a few hundred schemes starting to reopen. So, two things I can't do. So one is I'm not allowed to share slides. I did ask and they said no. And secondly, I can't comment on the two sessions I didn't attend. So during the whole day, there was 2 breakout sessions, and unfortunately, this Bobby can't be in 2 places at once. So I didn't attend the What Does Mansion House Mean for Pensions Strategies session, which was a very good session, apparently, run by Steve Hodder. And I also didn't attend the dashboard session run by Richard Jones, but I did attend and chair most of the other sessions. So we started the day with a session entitled Market Landscape, What It Means for Endgame Investment. And this was presented by Jared Francis from Schroeder. And he basically started off by discussing the market environment and the implications of the fact that we've got very tight credit spreads. So not much value in investing in investment grade credit at the moment. And so he then said that whilst in 2024, we had as many annuities bought as we did in 2023, this wasn't driven by annuity pricing. As he said, annuity pricing was now more expensive relative to gilts. And it was more driven by the end game solutions. So it surprised him slightly that we still had the same amount of annuities being bought in 2024. And then he said that he talked a little bit about the insurance allocations, so how the insurance allocate their assets to back their annuity books. And as credit is much less attractive, he showed that they backed upped their allocation to asset-backed securities and halved their allocation to investment-grade credit. So quite a big difference. I do wonder how we got that information though, because when I've ever asked the new insurers to provide the asset allocation underlying their books, they tend to be quite cagey. But that was his take on it anyway, and you got to trust the speaker is actually telling you the truth. And then they also said though that buy and maintain strategies, which a lot of schemes have got, is not really a match for annuity pricing anymore. And it's debatable whether it's a match for run-on. And again, for the same reason that the expense in credit portfolios. And then he finished off by looking at run-on portfolios, which tend to be LDI plus collateral, and the collateral tended to be credit. But now he's saying that much more you're seeing collateral of return targeting investment and private assets backing smaller allocations to LDI. So I'm sure that'll please Elspeth today. And that was basically the first session. Are there any questions on that session that I'll try to answer? But as I was cheering, I don't know if I took in as much as I would have done if I was just attending.
Okay, Con. Yep.
Yeah, let me just offer you a comment, Bobby.
Yeah.
One of the things last year, which is evident from the gross data, is that not only were the insurance companies, the bulk annuity providers, buying more structured credit, they were also retaining far more gilts than they had previously, which means that the net margin is not that great. Anyway, that's it's not just a straightforward switch from corporate credit to asset-backed. Far from it. Most of the duration that's being bought by the insurers is actually taking place in the gilts that they're not selling on.
Yeah, I think the default that they tend to match with is gilts. So I think when they saw credit isn't as attractive, they just haven't sold as many of those gilts and probably bought some gilts back. So it's a good observation, Con. So we've gone to session 2 then. So when the two speakers for session 1 and session 2 looked at the original agenda, they thought they'd be talking about exactly the same thing, but it actually was relatively different. So the second session was called a toolkit for navigating an evolving DB landscape, and that was presented by Andrew Reid from BlackRock. And he started by summarising the consolidators in the market, and then went through the annuity providers and just give an overall view as to what the market for consolidation providers looks like, and then covered things like new consolidators, including Clara. He discussed some of the capital-backed funding arrangements, the likes of Aspinall and Pension Safeguard. And then he summarised the run-on models and talked about LDI as well, and said there's a lot more LDI mandates being run now on what's called integrated LDI, which I've seen the market, the way he described it, for at least 10 years, which is effectively where your LDI manager takes discretion over all the assets, so they can make the collateral calls on which assets they take to back any collateral calls. And then he provided examples of 2 different run-on portfolios for level of risk and return. So one, he said for a return objective of around 0.2% per annum above gilt, so a run-on that's not looking to generate much return, was mainly credit and physicals now, and a return objective of 1% per annum was mainly leveraged LDI backed by growth and credit. So whilst the sessions were slightly different, the 2 conclusions at the end were pretty much the same thing, talking about LDI and what LDI strategy schemes are now running, and the change in the backing of those LDI strategies. And those 2 basically set the scene for the day in terms of the market landscape, but also set the scene in that it was predominantly, up until my sessions in the late afternoon, set talking about endgame, which did frustrate me somewhat. And I can say that as chair of the conference, I wasn't involved in the agenda, so it wasn't my doing to get that there. but I did try to change the agenda towards the end of the day, and I did. I'll tell you later what I did grab the very last session.
Bobby, just a
yeah.
quickie on LDI, and I know Con did a session, and we did a couple of sessions on Playpen on LDI. Has there been any schemes walk away fundamentally from LDI, i.e. burnt and then walked away, or do you think a majority of the LDI strategies are still in place and could be burnt again, or what's changed?
So my take from what I'm hearing from the consultants is that no one that had LDI has walked away from it. So whilst the overall message is that some schemes were banned, basically the message is that the schemes that didn't have as great an increase in funding than others were the ones that already had LDI, and the ones that didn't have LDI, there has been some more schemes have started doing LDI. But I think if schemes are going to run on, if schemes are going to buy out, they probably would look to come out with LDI, and I think some schemes might have done that, but I'm not hearing whole scale messages that schemes have come out of LDI.
Okay, we've got two hands raised. Con, you were first, then we'll come to Peter. But Con, do you want to comment first, and then we'll come to Peter?
Yeah, well, it's very difficult for people to walk away from LDI having done it, because that would open them to possible lawsuits from their members, given the magnitude of the asset losses. But what we have seen, and what's evident from the gross numbers, is that leveraged LDI is a far smaller proportion of the LDI that's being done now relative to what was true back in the early part of 2022. The other thing which is evident from the data that's out there is that the overall average hedge ratio being used by LDI funds in aggregate across all schemes is smaller than it was previously. The typical, or the average, is now somewhere between 70 and 74% of the interest rate liabilities, which are being hedged explicitly by LDI and leveraged LDI.
Yeah, makes total sense, and it's basically that the LDI collateral requirements went up massively, so schemes were not allowed to leverage as more. And I don't think what we've seen is then schemes buy more LDI to maintain their hedges. So I think the two are linked. So if your LDI costs more and you've got a hedge of 100, then if you only spend the same amount in your LDI, your hedge comes down to 75 or 80. So I think that's driven the main figures, I think.
Okay.
But not being a consultant for 3 years, I can't say for definite.
Okay, I appreciate that. Peter, what have you got a question or want to make a point?
It's essentially the same point as Con's just made, that I was questioning whether the proportion in leveraged LDI was maintained or whether it was just basic LDI, because they're essentially two entirely different things. LDI and its basic form is just matching your cash flows with a secure income stream. So I should imagine that is actually more attractive in the present market conditions than it was previously. But leveraged LDI, when I was being sold leveraged LDI by our investment consultant, I said, well, right, we'll go into leveraged LDI when the gilt yield goes above 5%, because in that situation, I think we'll be in the situation that we'll make money out of it. He refused to accept that as a strategy. So there we go. Thank you.
Yeah,
Cool.
I think increasingly we're seeing more different solutions in terms of liability matching, which isn't LDI derivatives, which I think is a good thing. And one of the solutions the market needs to find is how to efficiently put private assets into that. And that's just the whole Mansion House debate again, and the private assets and the funds in the transition. How the pension schemes that, when a small number of schemes invest in private assets, how do schemes en masse invest in private assets? Because they're not just there for growth, they're also good in some cases for liability matching. So then the next session, which was before the first break in the morning, was entitled Connecting the Dots Between Bulk Purchase Annuities and ESG Factors. And we had the presenter, Valeria Piani from Phoenix, who really talked about the ESG approach of annuity providers, and Alex Oakley from Standard Life, who effectively prices annuities and as a broker. And so they covered the fact that most annuity providers now are doing quite a lot on ESG, if I can use the word ESG, and provided case studies of where ESG in action had actually produced results in both private markets and in public markets. But then basically summarised that ESG for annuity providers is a requirement, and you have to tick a number of boxes to show that you're doing it properly, and you have to show that you are actually making a difference, but it isn't a decider between annuity providers at the moment. But basically the summary of that session was that most of the major annuity providers are now covering ESG the way most asset managers are, i.e. it's something that they take seriously and they need to be doing it to be able to get the business. We have a question off Con?
Yeah, Con. Yep. And then Billy.
Yeah, it's a question, Bobby. Was there any discussion of where, or if at all, defence stocks fit in ESG?
No.
Okay.
Not in the day. The big news on this, I think, came after the conference. It might be the same day or the day after. It was really close. But I think if the headlines had come out before the conference, it would have been discussed. But my recollection is that the headlines came out after the conference.
Okay, Billy, do you want to go? And then we, yeah, go on.
Sorry, what was discussed? So, I don't know how many of you know Mike Clark, but Rosebank was raised quite a few times.
Hi, Bobby. I'm involved with annuities, but what you would call the retail side, what I call real people. And I was just fascinated what you said about annuity providers with ESG. Do you have any practical examples of the sort of things that they'd be investing in? And that's one question. And the second question is going back to one of your very early comments about you talked about the spread on gilts. Were you suggesting the actuaries are saying that annuities are slightly worse value for money than they were in the past?
So answering your second question, yes, definitely saying that.
Okay.
In terms of your first question, I'm just seeing if I can open up the slides. I can't share them, but I could. There were examples in there on the slides. Maybe I should have done this beforehand. But if I can't find them now, I can certainly put you in touch with the presenters and they can give you some examples.
I'm just just interested. So I mean, don't go any trouble. But no, thanks. That's interesting.
Let me have a look. Maybe if I carry on with the next session now, while I can do that while I'm looking for the slides.
Con's put his hand up again, and then we might bring Podrag in if that's answered your question, Podrag. I don't know, but anyway, Con, you go first, and we'll see. Podrag.
Yeah, another quick question, Bobby. Rosebank, was the feeling in the meeting that it was going to go ahead or shouldn't go ahead? What was the meeting's feeling?
Okay, it was neither of those. The meeting's feeling was, if it goes ahead, there'll be a big decision for pension funds because a lot of pension funds are invested passively in Rosebank. So And generally the feeling in the room discussing with people was that for pension funds, well, not just even for pension funds, for UK in general, backing Rosebank would be seen as a backward step. It would just add fuel to the fire of the rhetoric from the US, irrespective of whether on its own, as a particular project, it would change, it would be beneficial in the very long term. The fact that it's the biggest project in oil and gas in the UK ever, at the time when President Trump's basically saying don't talk ESG and climate change, it just would be the wrong point. So the main discussion was around what could or what would pension schemes do if it went ahead.
Thanks.
Okay, Podreg, has that answered your question? Because you were making the point about annuity providers versus asset managers. Is that your question,
Sorry,
Podreg?
it's just
Yep.
a bit. It was merely just being a bit of a smart ass. I mean, frankly, they've
Surely
what
not.
said doesn't really mean anything. We've gone through the phase where ESG was being adopted, and we know it's become very apparent that there's a great deal of greenwashing or marketing going on still to this day, despite the fact that there are parameters in place that weren't there 5 years ago. So I think something I might be digging into very shortly, because there's just far too many unsatisfactory responses coming from the asset management community at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think the detail of what's going on is being covered elsewhere. But yeah, this conference is basically about making the right noises, and as Henry pointed out before the day, it really is driven by sponsors who sponsored the conference. But it was a good conference and some good points made. So then the next session was a session that we've covered quite a number of times at Pensions Playpen. And it was Richard Jones from Punter Southall, entitled "Where Have All the Surplus Has Gone?" And he basically covered two things. One, the fact that the surplus was reported as one number, and then vastly different numbers came out when the estimates were updated, and we've gone through that a number of times at Pensions Playpen. But in the context that he launched what's called Pension Safeguard at Punter Southall, which is an asset-backed proposition, and he launched it when surpluses were reported as massive, and then when surpluses came right down, it wasn't quite as marketable, so we had to just redo his story and think how we should then put it into the market, which he was very honest about that. And then he provided examples of how it could be used in practice. And he also provided examples of ESG action in both private and public markets, even for this asset-backed security. And there wasn't really any lessons from that. It just that it was reminding us about the fact that the estimates that are put out for surplus are estimates. And another asset-backed security. I think most of the new things we saw during the day were asset-backed security arrangements. So it definitely is the flavour of the day. I did ask him is what makes it different from being just another investment bond, and I got the same answer every time I've asked that before. That well, it's just slightly different because of this, but they are just investment bonds. Most of them, they don't really. If the bond doesn't perform, you don't get anything extra back. Tom?
Was there any discussion, Bobby, of asset-backed securities in a particular context, which is most asset-backed securities have very short durations, and their utility as hedging instruments in pension funds is really rather limited unless you leverage them.
Yeah, which was my point, that you're basically talking about a 10-year bond, or even if you agree to the maturity of the pension scheme, you're talking about a 14-year bond. So that was as far as we got. That's as detailed as we got.
Okay.
Yeah. So once you realise that it's basically an investment that you get paid back a certain amount, and it generates a certain return for you and for the and for the backers, then it has a place, but it's not a hedging instrument. It's more an instrument to make sure you don't have a shortfall if you're aiming to buy out in 5 to 10 to 15 years. That's the context in which this one was put forward. And then we had lunch, and it was a very nice lunch. Then we came back for the afternoon, and we went straight into a breakout session. So I thought that the session I was chairing on data was probably going to be not quite as good as the session that I wasn't chairing, which was Steve Hodder talking to Mansion House, because I've seen Steve Hodder present quite a lot. Sorry, this was the session before lunch, wasn't after lunch. It was the first breakout session just before lunch. But we had Dr. Tim Dry, and I don't know if any of you've met Dr. Tim Dry, but he's really good, and he's in a firm called Mortality Manifest, and he just talked through the importance of data for end games. I think we all know how important data is if you're going to try to buy out, but he went through it and basically covered the fact that you can have incorrect addresses, deceased members, gone away members, date of births missing, email addresses missing spouses even, and really talked about the techniques you can use to plug the gaps. And I was a little bit skeptical, saying, well, a lot of this missing data for a lot of pension schemes is paper. And how do you get paper information into search engines, for example? But he put me in place. So that basically what's there now, email addresses is a very strong and what indicator of members' identity. And if you get 2 or 3 items that match together, the email can usually be quite a strong one to help do that. And you only need statistically to get 3, maybe 4 items of data, then you're pretty sure that that member is the member you want and the member that exists. And my thought going into that was it was more about if you had the national insurance number, it was pretty sure, or you had the member's date of birth and name, then you're pretty sure. But he was like, well, things like address, for example, people move 8 times a year, so address isn't a reliable data factor. And the email address he said they probably changed twice in their lifetime. And phone number, the mobile number, they may never change it. So these 2 items, email address and phone number, are very good for matching together to get to check that a member exists. And once you check the member exists, then it becomes not as hard to contact the member and then to fill in the rest of the data. So it was a really interesting session, and I said that again. I don't know whether I was so interested because I was an actuary who was good at statistics, or whether I was actually interested because it just pricked the interest, and he was a really good presenter as well. Any questions on that session?
There was a question. Was that Dr. Tim Fowler? I think Peter.
No.
Do you want? No.
Dr. Tim Dry, Drye.
Thank you.
Mortality Manifest, his company is.
Do you know him, Peter?
Sorry, yes. No, I don't know. I just didn't quite catch the name, and I was just really asking. I will now investigate Dr. Tim Dry. Thank you very much.
Okay, so then we had lunch, and then the first session after lunch was Andrew Dodd from the pensions regulator. And full disclosure, I didn't chair this session. I got a session off. The PMI chaired this session, and the regulator gave an update on the funding code, and it was quite interesting. So there was some new stuff I wasn't aware of. So he covered the timescales with the new digital service being launched this year. And then he gave a snapshot of the regime in terms of what's long-term planning, what's schemes need to have the long-term plan in place, what the current funding position is, and then they need to report and assess. And there's been consultation on the statement of strategy and what information needs to be provided. And he said that they've taken this on board, that quite a lot of the information that is asked for is going to be a really big drain on resources for schemes. And he reported that as a result, they've made some changes. So, for example, they're amending the definition of small scheme to be any scheme less than 200 members. It used to be any scheme less than 100 members. So that, he said, that cuts out a vast number of schemes that won't have to provide the detailed information. They've also said that they're cutting down the cash flow information required from 100 years to 40 years. And then finally, everything is going to be submitted on spreadsheet. A spreadsheet that they're going to issue, which generated quite a lot of questions in terms of how clunky that would be, how even if you weren't filling in one of the 300 boxes, how would you then not fill it in? That would just still be 300 boxes to go through and to fill in. But he assured us that it was going to be a dynamic spreadsheet. So you'd answer the questions quite early on, and that in itself would cut out a lot of the other columns you need to fit, the other rows that you need to fit in. So answering no to a question might take the 300 down to 290, for example. But he said there's numerous parts of that. But he did give us the assurance that this is all going to be reviewed once every scheme's gone through it. But as schemes do valuations every 3 years, it's going to take 4 years before they have the information to actually do a proper review. So we're going to have this. He said they're very open to feedback, so I hope they are, because they don't want, if things are coming out that have been difficult, then they can make some interim changes, he said, and they were open to that. But the formal full review of how it's working will happen in 2029. So how that's, I think there was a lot of concern in the room that it is going to be quite difficult to fill in and take up quite a lot of resource. And I think he recognises that it is going to be more effort than is currently put into reporting on valuations. So I think it's just one we have to suck it and see, and just take him for his word that he will take on board feedback. Because I, for one, will be, if I see this has been really clunky, try to shout about it and talk to them about it and see if they can make interim changes if it's not working.
Bobby, sorry.
Yeah.
With a load of people in the room, did anybody not pipe up and talk about AI or automation or API connectivity? That sounds very clunky in March 2025, doesn't it?
Yeah. So not really, because I think you've got a room of consultants and schemes who probably couldn't be the other end of that. So they probably couldn't provide it in that format. Generally, the people who are in the room. So it's a good point. I think what you will find is that the market, with all the people who are doing AI solutions, will very quickly try to fill the gap there and try to provide solutions there to help it not be so clunky. But then it's some of the questions you wonder how AI will cope with them. But I think you've just got to. We've got to see the spreadsheet first. We've got to see what the questions are, and what information it's driving out of the valuation process. Because my big concern here is that if you start changing how you do your valuation and start coming out with different answers just so it makes it easier to fill in a spreadsheet, that is not a good outcome. The spreadsheet should just be reflecting the information that you can get from your valuation process. I'm still concerned that there will be schemes that change what they do so they fit into fast track, because fast track is going to be so much simpler to complete. So maybe
but there's going to be one spreadsheet, or would you say there'll be 3 or 4 versions depending on the nature of your scheme? Spreadsheet.
He said there's going to be one spreadsheet. It brought to mind the spreadsheet they send out for the reporting of funding levels, the quarterly one they send out to schemes to collect the information. But it sounds like a slightly bigger and more complicated version of that. So we'll see. We'll have to wait and see.
Henry's typing, so we'll have to see if Henry's got an opinion. But that sounds very clunky.
Yeah,
But it just is.
yeah, it does. So anyway, the next session. The next session was Ellie McKinnon from the Cheviot Trust, really describing the objectives of the trust, its purpose, and how they do very efficient consolidation for the schemes that they look after. This was a breakout session. The alternative session that I wasn't in was the dashboard session. And she wasn't really giving any messages out there other than consolidation can be done and it can be done efficiently, but these are the things you need to do to make sure it's done efficiently. And I asked her about my small DC scheme that I've just taken on, and she was, oh, we can definitely consolidate that, until I mentioned that we've got a GMP underpin, and then the face sort of dropped. So I think it's very easy to consolidate simple schemes. But one of the points I made to people in the conference was, if you want to see how easy or how hard it is to consolidate a DB scheme, just go to any reasonable sized DB scheme and see how many sections they've got. If it was simple, they'd have merged those sections. And it's not just that, they won't just have separate liability sections. Quite a number of schemes will have separate segregated asset sections as well. So if schemes can't consolidate themselves, consolidation isn't impossible, but it's not quite as easy as you think. Then the next session, which was back to a plenary session, was a good session because it was all about the importance of admin. And I think we keep having admin sidelined, and I think the more we can get admin actually up front, the better it's going to be for everybody, because for any run on or buyout, we need to have good admin systems, and administrators need to be valued. It was run by John Shotton from Capita and covered why admin was important. And he did discuss AI, both in terms of the service that you provide to pensioners and to members, but also how you actually manage admin internally. So he discussed quite a bit how you could use admin to do smart workflow around multiple locations and multiple teams. And he showed an interesting slide, which was what you would generally expect from an administrator, and said that the bottom half of this slide, he had about 6 items below the line and above the line. So the bottom half is what you've always had from an administrator and you'd expect from an administrator. And the top half was what technology is allowed. So in terms of better workflow, member engagement, communications, the use of AI to do some of these things. So admin in itself is now potentially better than it was. But then the overall point that if you don't value your admin, you're just going for price, lowest price, then you can't expect your admin to expand into these other areas. You need to recognise, that these things cost money and these things cost resource. And he did cover the fact that they are having a lot of pressure from annuity providers and risk teams pinching their the good admin people. So that's driving the need to resource from outside the UK quite a lot, because it's getting very difficult to recruit good administrators and then keep good administrators at the salaries we pay them. It's a bit of a sobering session, but with some optimism in terms of the use of AI. Then we
Bobby,
then went
sorry,
into,
on the
yeah,
role of admin, was I wasn't there, you were, but the role of passer, is passer going strong? Is it growing from strength to strength, or is it declining, or was passer mentioned?
passer wasn't mentioned. Simple answer.
Thought I'd ask.
Yeah, no, it wasn't mentioned. Might have been in the discussions in the breaks, but it wasn't mentioned in the main presentation. Okay, so then we went to the final two sessions. First one I was due to present at was on harnessing DB surpluses for economic growth. And I was joined by Ali Tiabi from Bonnet Wadden and Mark Baker from Pinsent Masons. The session covered the potential use of surplus if new rules are brought in. We first went through what potential new rules could be and the views on the potential use. So what the new rules might be, how they may affect the balance of power between trustees and sponsors, and then what will trustees want to ensure. And the general view was that there's not really a motivation at the moment out there for trustees to go out and do loads of work on surplus. It would generally have to be an employer move, and the rules would have to be significant enough to make the employer want to move beyond the conversations that are already happening. So it might be really beneficial to a small number of schemes that are already looking to use surplus, that might clarify rules and create a roadmap for them which they can go down. But for schemes that aren't really having that conversation, unless there's some significant changes in legislation or changes in fiduciary duty, we couldn't really see how the schemes trustees were generally going to go and look to try and use surplus up. And the next session then went on to how schemes are practically.
Sorry, Bobby, we've got a hand raised from Peter.
Yeah.
And then Martin Tingle's put in some stuff regarding a scheme, but anyway, we'll come back to that. Peter, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. No, it was on this DB use of surplus thing. Yes, I think your comment there is that any pressure there is likely to come from employers rather than the trustees, who my discussions with other trustee chairs and such like indicated that use of surplus to fund administration costs is about as far as they are prepared to go in the short term, at least. From the employer's point of view, was there any discussion about the impact of accounting treatment on use of surplus? Because, for example, the use of surplus in a DB scheme to fund contributions to a DC section or scheme hits problems with IAS 19 and such like, and the full cost of the DC contributions has been charged to the profit and loss account. I'm just wondering how much discussion there was around that, if any.
There wasn't necessarily discussion about what the accounting rules were, but there was definitely the comment that they needed to be taken into account. So to make it easier, one of the things that needed to be looked at was the accounting treatment, for example. So it was in that context of, if the government's going to change the rules to make it easier, then that's one of the things that would need to change.
Yes. And of course, that's not under the control of the UK government, because it's an international accounting standard for comparison purposes. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Martin, did you want to talk about your point, or are you just saying that there are many complications with these schemes?
Yeah, I was just reinforcing what Bobby was saying about consolidating DB. There was one scheme I knew which had, wasn't large, had come about by a manufacturing group shrinking and merging and bringing in other schemes, and they'd ended up with sections of the pension scheme which had no known members, and other sections that had about 3 members, each of which was on slightly different rules. So actuarial involvement was involved every time any of them, did anything like asked for early retirement quotes. It was, a hassle, but we were just waiting for them to retire and the problem would go away.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't discuss consolidation much on the day, but my point in breaks, and my point that I keep making about consolidation is really in a lot of it's in reaction to the fact that some of the other problems, like the spreadsheet, like the transition investments, the answer I tend to get back is this is why schemes consolidate. And the message I'm getting is that the regulator thinks that if they make the regulations harder, only big schemes with resources can do the work. In fact, what's going to happen is they're just going to be squeezing these smaller schemes to be less and less compliant, but squeezing the costs up. So unless there's some overriding legislation to simplify benefits and to have basically to create losers, so benefit members that will lose by the simplification of benefits, because the other option is you level everybody up, which is very costly, then I can't see mass consolidation happening. So, which comes back to when I'm asking the question about how you deal with stuff, that we should get proper answers and proper solutions for small schemes, not just battered off to say, well, small schemes should consolidate then. Anyway, so we did then talk about some of the practical things that schemes have done with surplus. And it was the things everyone will have heard about, paying DC contributions, which wasn't necessarily actually benefiting any members, and that again, unless the regulations change, to have proper use of surplus as a conversation between everybody, you need to have uses which include improving member benefits and some payback to the employer, and probably still having some surplus left as a buffer, because then you have the problems if you spend too much of the surplus and then you put the scheme into deficit, or you actually doing something to that detriments schemes members, and we all know what the legislation says about that. So it just doesn't. We couldn't see overall for this session that the use of surplus, which the government seems to be putting out there, is we've got this massive surplus we can use to fund UK economic growth. We couldn't actually see that message joining up and being joined together and actually being that's what's going to happen, because there's so many questions about whether schemes reduce the surplus anyway. By the time you get to what surplus is used, then assuming that that's going to be used to invest in the UK to generate economic growth was quite a big assumption, and probably not going to carry much water, to be fair. So then we go on to the last session. The last session was the future of DB pensions. Now, 2 weeks before the conference, they didn't have a speaker for this, and last year's conference, the only thing I did at the conference was the last session, which was the future of DB pensions. They asked me, I said, well, I can't do the same one. It was too late to prepare it again. Two, it'd be boring to do it again. I might do it again next year, because I did put some predictions in there, but doing it this time just wasn't appropriate. But I've just launched the Trustee Sustainability Working Group, so I thought, can I do it as a call to action on climate? And a couple of days after the session, we published a document which basically says the so what of climate change for schemes. So it says, if you're a big scheme, if you've got limited resources this year, what actions can you take to maximize your climate impact? For medium schemes, the same, and for small schemes, the same. And obviously there's more things big schemes can do than small schemes. So I signposted that, and I basically got a consultant who was who's a climate expert, and he basically scared the room into saying, well, climate change is something you need to be aware of, and you need to try to help solve it. We then had Mike Clark come up, who apologised for saying that pension schemes could solve the crisis, but he recognises now that they can't. They shouldn't have never been given that banner. but they can pay a significant part, and he's working with the regulator quite a bit and with Essex University and USSS, etc. So he gave a bit of an insight as to how practically pension schemes can move this conversation forward, and how we can together try to get rid of some of this reporting, which has just taken the effort away from action. And that was basically that session. We were basically getting climate change back on the agenda and saying, but practically, what can we do as schemes? So, and we got with the questions and the feedback afterwards was a nice refreshing end to the day, actually, because it's, if anyone knows me, I'm all about practical solutions, and so we did give some practical solutions, and it wasn't just a bit of a you need to take climate change seriously, and you're sitting there thinking, well, how can I? I'm a small scheme or I'm a medium scheme and I can't do anything. So,
what were your practical solutions, Bobby?
So I'll give you an example. So we said top on stewardship. So we broke it down into different areas. But say for stewardship, so the really big schemes, I've probably been doing stewardship forever. So you didn't set up the stewardship policy to combat climate change. But the policy, your general policy, which goes across all issues, might not be totally appropriate for the climate change discussion. So just go back and look at your policy and see what impact. Make sure your climate change discussions are actually maximising the impact on companies in the area of climate change. And then for medium schemes, you probably set up your stewardship policy as a reaction to ESG regulations. But you've probably tried to boil the ocean, so you're probably trying to do governance across all your assets, when actually, if you've got limited resources this year, just concentrate on climate change. The rest of it's not going to have as much of an impact. It's got a longer term view. So if you've got limited resources this year, concentrate your stewardship on climate change. And in smaller schemes, don't try and have a stewardship policy across your thousands of schemes in an index tracking fund. It's just not going to work. But there are industry initiatives that we're launching. So I flagged the fact that there are some industry initiatives coming out for small scheme stewardship, which I've covered in a few different sessions. But basically what the initiative is that we've seen a way where we can effectively call on 2,500 small schemes as a voice. So it might be one or two issues a year. Then we just call on this scheme and say, look, this issue, we want pension schemes to get behind. Are you behind it? And effectively, if they've signed up, we haven't actually got the practicalities fully sorted yet. But if they say yes, then we'll be able to go to all the fund managers and say, look, these 2,500 pension schemes who are your clients want you to back this, want you to do something here. And that's better than them just writing a bland ESG policy in their SIP and photocopying the top 5 votes from the LGIM voting policy into the implementation statement.
Okay, we've got a few minutes to go, but Martin has very kindly put an interesting comment in the chat. Quite sort of challenging. And Derek, you've raised your hand. Derek, you go first, and then I'll come back to Martin's comment. Go on, Derek, you go first.
The PMI has always had a foot in both camps, trying to organise professional trustee standards, but also sponsoring the Association of Member-nominated Trustees. Do you have any sense at the conference, Bobby, what the proportion was in terms of trustees? Was it most? You've mentioned consultants, you've mentioned people sponsoring the conference, but what kind of real trustees did you have there in the room?
There were a few trustees there, but I'm not sure. I think the APPT has most of the professional trustees. For example, when I first became a professional trustee, I was at Capita Cranfield. They require you to be APPT, not PMI. But I had to join the PMI because you have to do, the PMI owns the 2 exams that you need to pass to be accredited. But there's no requirement to be a member of the PMI. And in fact, the PMI seems to be aiming to get new young trustees in, and they've got like 6 or 7 stages of PMI exams to become accredited with the PMI. So I don't know the numbers, but my feeling is that most professional trustees are APPT registered and not PMI registered for their trusteeship and do their CPD through the APPT. I do know the PMI are trying to get more and more professional trustees registered with them because they're trying to get me registered with them. But there's from a professional trustee's viewpoint, there's not really it's not as attractive to be PMI because the APPT is the professional trustees professional body, and I don't really see a massive benefit that I get as a professional trustee from the PMI because it seems to be training people. It's more aimed at training people through the careers. Most professional trustees are probably at the back end of their career rather than the front.
Yeah, good answer, Bobby. Okay, Peter, you got your hand raised.
Yes, just on that point. I've been at the PLSA investment conference last week, and also at similar PLSA events, which, with my long experience in pensions, originally they were very much dominated by trustees, particularly lay trustees, including member nominated and other so-called non-professional trustees, which and I have noticed a great decline in the representation of the non-professional category at those meetings, and much more dominance by professional trustees and others in the pensions industry rather than in the role of us as a trustee exercising their fiduciary duty. So I think this is something that perhaps needs to be addressed at a sort of global scale, that trustee boards should consist of lay as well as professional trustees, is my personal view, but there we go.
Mine as well. I've said it on the stage a couple of times. I've said that the professionalisation of trustees, if you do it too much, you're going to drive out the non-professional trustees, and the non-professional trustees are valuable, and especially in the diversity scenario and cognitive diversity, you get so much value from member trustees. But a lot of member trustees have already been driven out by the professionalism requirements that even the member nominated trustees need to have.
Yeah, great comment, Bobby. Absolutely brilliant. Probably the last point now, just going back to Martin's point. This is going back to the surpluses. Large surpluses appear relatively quickly. They could disappear as quickly. It's a trustee's duty not to look after the members and beneficiaries, not the employer and UK PLC. Bit of a challenge at the end, Bobby. Bit of a challenge at the end. But what do you think? I mean,
that's exactly my point. There's a lot of talk in the industry about use and surplus for this, that, and the other. That talk in the industry and that talk in the press is not changing the trustees' duty to look after the members, which is why, for that even to be seriously considered by the trustees, it needs to come through the employer. And so not only does the regulation, etc., need to change, from where a trustee stands, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. They've got the scheme into a good position with the surplus, so the chances of paying members have increased. Why, as a trustee, would you then start reducing that protection? I mean, if you look at your fiduciary duty, it's very, you might look at that to basically enhance members' benefits, for example, to make members better off. But why would you even think about using up some of that surplus?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, Bobby. Okay, we're towards the end of the session. Any other questions? Any other comments? Any other thoughts that you'd like to raise with Bobby? I think you'll all agree. And Derek, yep, go on, you go.
Just on the surplus thing, I mean, there obviously are schemes out there, quite big schemes, which have not been giving pensioners increases for parts of their accrued benefits. And these strike me as schemes where the trustees are sitting on their hands and not doing anything. They may be dominated by employer representative trustees, which is why the employer view to do nothing is pervasive. But, I mean, going back, I mean, the other thing which probably we don't want to hear, but I think if inflation went above 5%, you would see this come back on the agenda, assuming you've still got surplus. And I think Martin makes a good point that surpluses do seem to be ephemeral the way the actuaries estimate them. But not getting at you, Bobby.
No, there was some discussion about using it for increasing member benefits, and I think there is a bit of discussion going on about this. I think we need to get more discussion about that in the industry. Bring it. It should. In my opinion, the discussion on using surplus to increase member benefits to combat against inflation should be as high on the agenda as the discussion about using surplus to return to the employer in some way or other. Which again is, if you're doing that, well, I suppose if you're doing this, if you're paying to members, it is getting into the economy because it's then spent by members. But it's not funding the investments that the government wants to fund. But definitely, I think we should have more of those discussions, and maybe it's for us as like the trustee bodies, and maybe I take a bit of responsibility for this to start getting those discussions out there, rather than the consultants tending to talk more about the employer side. And I'm not bashing consultants, but maybe that's why they're getting the pressure from that side, from the government and the regulator. So maybe we should just pop up from the other side and say, actually, have you thought about this?
Yeah. Okay, Peter, you got your hand raised, and then we'll move on. So, Peter, what would you like to say?
Yes, just to say that in the last fortnight, I've had a discussion with the employer with a scheme with a very large surplus, and the employer has agreed to using discretionary powers and indeed augmentation beyond discretionary powers to enhance benefits, both accrued and in payment, and also to continue to fund the scheme on the assumption that the surplus didn't exist. So they're paying in the contributions for a certain level of benefits going forward, with the view that in a number of years' times, if that surplus remains, they may well be able to reflect it in the employer's funding rate. As it happens, the employer's funding rate has been, on the balance of cost, has been able to be pulled down anyway, and indeed we've been able to offset the rise in national insurance costs for the employer by a reduced pension scheme contribution for an open DB scheme. So it's a win-win from both the employer's point of view and also from the member's point of view. So, okay.
I love listening to you, Peter, because you keep giving us the good news stories in DB pensions. And I keep using your examples to people on a no-names basis.
Well,
and on that, that's good. Thank you, Peter. Yeah. Sorry, Peter, go on.
No, I was just going to say that's the advantage of having an open DB scheme.
There you go. There you go. Okay. Well, on that positive note, I think we'll have lots of clapping and lots of thanks coming in for Bobby. Great session, Bobby. Thank you very, very much for that. Really appreciate it. We'll put the video up on the Playpen site this afternoon, plus the podcast. And thanks everyone for your input today, your questions, and joining in. Really appreciate everybody's input to Playpen. And Bobby, great session. Next week, we've got Ian Beeston from Money Alive giving us an update on scheme communications, consumer duty, and all those lovely things. So hopefully you can join us next week on that session. And as usual, we pray for peace in the East, and we're nearly there, maybe for at least a ceasefire in the East, but we'll see. So depends what the two powers can agree. But there we go. Thanks so much indeed, Bobby. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of your week. We'll see you at the next session on Pension Playpen. Thank you very much indeed, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye. Bye.